I was 22, I had one of my biggest teachable moments. And that was the day that I walked into a health food store for the first time. I didn't even know what a health food store was. And I saw the book, You Are What You Eat. And I thought, boy, am I in trouble. By Adele Davis. And that was one of those moments that changed the course of my life. And on that day, I started eating very differently. I've had many times in my life where I've had that teachable moment. I'm striving for a few people in here, maybe more than a few, to have a teachable moment about bones today. Because bones, that's something we all have in common. We might not have other things in common, but we all have a skeletal structure that must carry us through a lifetime. And the bones are quite amazing. As a chiropractor, of course, I've been into bones and joints for a long time, but I also taught about bone. I taught osteology, and I love bone. I think we tend to think about bone as something that we find on the desert, but it's not. Bone is actually it is dynamic. And in fact, bone is a reservoir of nutrients. So if we don't take in nutrients properly, and by the way, Tums isn't it. In case any of you wanted to know that one, Tums is not it. But if we don't take in the right amount of nutrients and the right balance, our bones are definitely going to suffer. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how bones work and the amazing job that these bones have. By the time we're 18, we have laid down 80% of our lifetime bone. So you just wonder, what is it that makes some of these kids even grow, right? Because hormones are really at play at big time in teenage years, and it seems that it can even overcome horrible diets, which it does to some extent. And then by the time we're 29, pretty much that natural growth has stopped. I mean, we have reached our peak bone mass. It's not to say that we can't affect that bone mass anymore, but we have pretty much reached our peak bone mass. And it's much more challenging after the age of 30 to build up bone density, but it's always possible to build up bone quality. Now, you can build up bone density, and I'm going to talk about how that can be done, but it's not simple. I wished it was simple, and I have bought into many things over the years looking for a magic bullet. I've not found one, unless I found that, in fact, somebody, say, had a vitamin D deficiency or something major going on, and I was able to correct that, or a parathyroid disease or something else, which I'm also wanting to get across that if people have been diagnosed with osteoporosis, you really have to make sure you've had a good workup, because that's not what's happening. Usually what's happened is Fosamax. We watch Sally Field on television. How many remember what Sally Field is famous for? The flying nun. Well, I'd like to just point out for a moment that flying is a non-weight-bearing exercise. I'm going to get into exercise in a moment, but I'd like to just suggest that perhaps, maybe, her flying around that stage all those years wasn't good for her bones. But anyway, I digress. So we hear about bone density, and that's when people are diagnosed with whether they have a low bone mass or osteoporosis, we hear about bone density. Nothing measures bone quality. Bone quality is a much larger picture. Bone density is only part of that picture. So in other words, if somebody has, gluten intolerance or celiac disease, which is actually an autoimmune condition, food sensitivities, or anything going on with the digestive tract where their digestion is not good, they might not be absorbing a lot of the nutrients that they need for their bone. Or, on the other hand, if all those things are good, their bone quality is going to be better, which is why some people with the same bone density may be doing just fine and not fracturing any bones at all, and while others do fracture. So we have to understand that this business about bone quality is super, super important. And all of the speakers that you've heard today have spoke about that from one way or another, whether it's a spiritual element of it, which I believe deeply, whether it's innate that we've been talking about and subluxation and all of that. This is just part of that same picture. So what I'm really about is helping everybody connect to these bones that are basically usually silent unless we have a fracture or unless we're told we have osteoporosis. My own story with my own bones is this. In 1994, I was diagnosed with borderline osteoporosis. On that day, I felt physically weak. I'd never felt weak a day in my life. That diagnosis, I allowed that diagnosis to make me feel weak. What did it mean? Did it mean that all of a sudden I couldn't play tennis? I had to give up running? What did it mean? And back then, they just wanted to recommend medications for me. And I was borderline osteoporosis. I'm 63. I just this year hung up my roller skates. And I do still have osteoporosis. My own journey has not been an easy one. I would like to stand up here and say, I cured myself. But I haven't. I still have borderline osteoporosis, and my own journey has been back and forth. I've gained some, I've lost some. But my bone quality is good. I haven't fractured a bone yet. I'm not afraid of my body. I don't see myself as fragile. But I'm also here to say that osteoporosis in its more advanced stages is a debilitating condition. There is no question about it. And I see people every day in my practice who have fractures. And an osteoporosis fracture is one in which is sustained with minimal trauma. It's one you just shouldn't have had. On the other hand, I've had people come in to me who have been recommended Fosamax. No one's really questioned them and talked to them about, how did you fracture that bone? I fell off my bike going 60 miles an hour. That sounds reasonable to me. Okay, that sounds reasonable. But then on the other hand, I have people who, with very little trauma, have fractured a bone. And that is of significant concern. On the other hand, we have people, and I'm dealing with a lot of folks in this situation right now who have been on these drugs. There are a particular category of drugs called bisphosphonates. Fosamax is one of them, and Boniva, which is what Sally Field talks about and so forth, that have been on these drugs for 7 to 10 years. And now what we're seeing is compromised bone. They are fracturing bones because they've been on the drugs. And why is that? Because they have affected something I talked about a moment ago, which is the bone quality. Here's how bone works. Bone has an interesting way of maintaining health. It has these cells called osteoclasts, which chew up and get rid of old bone. And it has other cells called osteoblasts, which lay down new bone. And we need this process so that every 7 years, thereabout, we build up a new structure. Otherwise, we would have what? A bunch of old bone and fragile bone. So we need these osteoclasts to get rid of old bone. But those drugs, the bisphosphonates, do one thing, and they go after the osteoclasts. They kill them, or they overly suppress them. And if you do that for too long, you end up with fragile bone. So there was a woman who I saw who was interviewed on Diane Sawyer. And then I asked her if she would come on my program and let me interview her. And by the way, you can get these free on my website, but I did interview her. And she herself had sustained a fracture because she had been on the bisphosphonates or Fosamax for 10 years. But here is how she fractured her bone. She was on a subway in New York, or it could have been BART. And you know how when it comes to a halt, does this a little bit? That was it. The mid of her femur snapped in half. Now, this is real. This is only going, and I'm also going to say it's only going to happen to a small percentage of people. And I'm also here to tell you that I am not opposed to wise use of these drugs. I think Western medicine is amazing when it's used properly, but what I continue to see, whether it's osteoporosis or hormone imbalance or thyroid or whatever the heck it is, or depression or whatever, people are not getting a good workup. They're not getting the right lab work to figure out if you're losing bone. Because by the way, if you get a diagnosis of osteoporosis, you've only had one bone density test, it doesn't mean you're losing bone at all. Maybe you never gained it. Maybe you were like me. The reason I have osteoporosis today is not what I'm doing today. It's because when I was 12 years old, I started smoking cigarettes. Timothy Leary was in the area. It's amazing I can string sentences together. Okay? And, you know, I ate a lot of sugar. I did a lot of things that weren't good for my bones. So I didn't get what? I didn't build up a good bank account of bone so that I was at a deficit by the time I hit my early menopause, which was another issue, because during menopausal years, you can lose up to 20%. I see it. I can keep that from happening with people by working with nutrition and making sure they're getting adjusted and all the good things I know to do. It doesn't have to happen. And the tidbits I have to offer in this short time, because I do very long talks on all of this, but I want all of you to go away with something that's usable, okay? Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Michael Pollan. He's written a number of good books, right? On, I can't think of the name of it right now. The Omnivore's Dilemma. Omnivore's Dilemma. But he has this one thing he says, which I love. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And I would further say this is about connecting with our food. I do not believe that we can continue to eat bad foods day in and day out unless we're disconnected. So one thing I would offer you is to take one meal a day, one snack a day. This could be that time where you're eating something, quote unquote, you think you shouldn't eat. It's okay. No distractions. No discussion, no radio going on, no TV, no computer. You and that experience of food. You take your plate or unwrap a Snickers bar. Could be whatever you choose to observe that moment, because it's the observation that allows us to be more connected. So you just take that one meal, one snack, and you observe putting how much, if you're doing a plate, how much you're putting on the plate. You sit down, you slowly eat. You chew the food, you taste it. You notice the food choices that you're making. You notice if you're full. You slow the whole process down. And if it was that time that you happened to choose that Snickers bar, the toughest work is there. The toughest work is there because then you must observe if you're then going into that self-critic. Because I deeply believe it's that self-critic that starts the ball rolling again for the next time. Anybody know about the self-critic? I don't know if this was true, but I've heard the story many times. When the Dalai Lama came here, he didn't know what that was. Can you imagine living in a society? I mean, we're not born popping out of them going, I hate my thighs, as a baby, I mean, it just doesn't happen. So is what I'm talking about bone? Yes. Because I could be talking about bone, I can be talking about heart, I can be talking about just about anything if I have 20 minutes and bring it back to the same stuff. It's about being connected. It's about understanding that what we eat, that in fact you are what you eat. We are what we think. And that self-love and the generosity, which we're going to get to hear about today, has to be pointed towards ourselves. If we can't be generous with ourselves and love ourselves down to the bone, then it really is difficult to extend that out to others. But when we do it, or we allow ourselves to give it to ourselves, that's when that happens. Okay, back to the bone. So here are a few tidbits. Things to add in terms of diet into your food for your bones. Figs. Figs are amazing. Are they not this time of year? Oh my goodness, figs are just fantastic, loaded with calcium. Very, very good. Greens, of course. Kale. Kale's fantastic. And if you don't like to eat kale in terms of cooking kale chips are not so bad. The dried kale, fantastic. And prunes. And they have a double benefit for some of us who are getting older. But anyway. Oh, wait. They don't want to call them prunes now. It's what? Dried plums. They're trying to... I'm never going to be... Does anyone ever do that without laughing? No, I can't do that. They're prunes. They're prunes. Okay? They're prunes. Yes, they're prunes. And yeah, raisins are raisins. What are you going to call them? Grapes? I don't know, something. Anyway. But anyway, yeah, but prunes have been shown in animal studies to actually impact bone. And one human study that was fairly decent. Now, they said 12 prunes. I actually called the woman who was the lead investigator on this. I said, okay, how many people in your study had problems with 12 prunes a day? She said, none. I said, I'm sorry, I can't believe that. I got up to 6. But let's just say that it's a good food to add in. So 4 or 6 a day is fine. If you can do 12, more power to you, But I wasn't able to reach that. Okay, so now exercise, some tidbits with exercise. Definitely we know in terms of bone, to stay healthy, you have to stress the bone. Swimming's not going to do it. Elliptical training's not going to do it. These are all good things and they're helpful. But if we're really talking about building bone, remember I said earlier, it's going to take harder work. Definitely weights will do it. Our ancestors were out doing a lot of physical activity all day long, or even kneading bread, which would keep the wrists quite healthy. But we're not, most of us aren't doing that. We're like typing, we're sitting down, blah, blah, blah. Walking seems to be a good enough exercise if you're doing it well and doing a good pace to maintain the hips pretty well. But the spine's much more difficult, particularly in small women. Why small women? Because we've learned from the astronauts, when the astronauts go into outer space, they can come back with 20% less bone mass in a 2 to 3 month period. Smaller women like me are the number one woman I'm going to want to test for bone density because we don't have that pressure coming down in our spine. So I use weight vests. I have a 10-pound one that I run with, and I have a 20-pound one that I'm just graduated to. But it has to be coming from the shoulders down. There's also another brilliant interview. I'm not saying I'm brilliant, but the guy I interviewed was, and his name's Clinton Rubin, and it is a really good video on vibration. I think this is the way that it's going. It's not the vibration equipment that knocks your teeth out. This is very light vibration. So anyway, that's worth seeing, and that's free on my website as well. But exercise, balance. Oh my goodness. Let's keep ourselves from falling in the first place. So some people may not be able to go to the gym and work out. There's so many ways to work with people. Tai Chi, yoga, balance, balance, balance. Wearing sensible shoes. No, but she's the MC today. She could do it here. This is good, okay. But they're cute. No. No, and this is one of my jokes, though. One of my jokes is that I think I'm safer on my roller skates than most women are in their high heels, because I'm really paying attention, and high heels can get caught and stuff, so it's a little bit easier on a day like today, but they can be pretty difficult. And I would just hate to break an ankle falling off my shoe. I mean, I want to say, I was roller skating or I was doing something else. I'm not quite sure. So, I have 1 minute. We can make meaningful change in 1 minute. That teachable moment, that moment where we're open, where we can take things in. And I'd like to have all of us, since I have 1 minute, let's just kind of use that, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Let's do that as a chant 3 times together. Ready? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Thank you.